This one might be a little controversy because a lot of times when we talk about certain subject matters, my father used to say, if you take a rock and throw it in a big crowd of dogs, only the dog that the rock hit is gonna yell. So when we throw these rocks, these intellectual rocks, these rocks of information and knowledge, those dogs that it hit, those are the one that's gonna yell. So I'm gonna throw a rock right now, and don't be surprised if the dogs start yelling. This particular article, New York Times, February 11th, 2014. New York Times, February 11th, 2014. Title of the article, Camels Had No Business in Genesis. That's the book of Genesis in the Bible. Camels had no business in Genesis. Now, this particular article is written by a gentleman by the name of John Noble Wilford. John Noble Wilford. And the significance of this article is dealing with research and study. Because a lot of times, like under the material I explained to you about the Newsweek magazine, we were under the impression that human beings, again, this is based on a religious, a biblical, much less, an explanation for the origin of human beings versus what science said. So when science came into play, a lot of the material that we gave as explanations for beginnings had to be somewhat put to the side. So when we were talking about the universe were made in 6 days, well, science says 14.5 billion years that the universe took. About 14.5 billion versus 6 days. That's a big leap, excuse me. So again, in keeping with that particular direction and looking at the science in relationship to what the stories that have been told to us have to offer, again, that doesn't mean the story doesn't have meaning. It just means that from a historical point of view, it doesn't have that kind of credibility. So, but let's look at the subject matter. The issue is that there was a reference made in a statement in regard to Genesis when Abraham is making a statement to one of his houseboys to go out and fetch him a camel. Now, Truss wasn't the individual who was making this assessment. It happened to be a rabbi who happened to be a professor at Tel Aviv University in Israel. And he said that the problem he had with it was he is a professor of that, but he also studies anthropology and archaeology. And he said that he found that to be a problem because that according to the story, if Abraham would have lived, according to their estimate, he would have lived in between 1500 BC and 2000 BC. 1500 BC and 2000 BC. And what the professor was saying was he don't believe there was no camels in Egypt at the time. Because one thing he also began to realize that for those of us who happened to go to Egypt and to actually had the opportunity, the blessing to witness and see the writings of Africans on the walls of the tombs and the temples of ancient Egypt, one thing you do not see, never, at no time on none of them walls, and that's a camel. There's no camel on nothing in ancient Egypt. I used to say the only time camels and pyramids came together was on a pack of cigarettes. But in this case, this is a university professor, Tel Aviv University. He's making this particular claim. And again, like in this first article, I would like to read a couple of paragraphs to give you some insight on what they went through in order to establish this particular fact in regard to biblical history versus what we have scientific evidence for. My glasses. Again, New York Times, February 11th, 2014, Camels Have No Business in Genesis, by John Noble Wilford. There are too many camels in the Bible, out of time and out of place. Camels probably had little or no role in the lives of such early Jewish patriarchs as Abraham, Jacob, Joseph, who lived in the first half of the second millennium BC. And yet, stories about them mention these domesticated pack animals more than 20 times. Genesis 24, for example, tells of Abraham's servant going by camel on a mission to find a wife for Isaac. This anachronism are telling evidence that the Bible was written or edited long after the events it narrates and is not always reliable as verifiable history. Now let me read that again because I want you to really understand the depth and the importance of what has just been said. It says the anachronisms, anachronism, that's a word that means at a time and at a place. It's like the example would be Jesus wore Nike sneakers. Nike sneakers and Jesus could not exist at the same time because those are two different things. Jesus, the first century, Nike's the 20th century. You get it? Anachronism. Two things that can't exist at the same time. And in this case, it says these anachronisms are telling evidence that the Bible was written or edited long after the events it narrates and is not always reliable as verifiable history. These camel stories do not encapsulate memories from the second millennium, said Noah Mizrahi, an Israeli biblical scholar, but should we view as back projections from a much later period. Dr. Mizrahi likened the practice to a historical account of medieval events that veers off to a description of, quote, how people in the Middle Ages used semi-trailers in order to transport goods from Europe, from European kingdoms to another. For two archaeologists at Tel Aviv University, the anachronisms were motivation to dig for camel bones at an ancient copper smelting camp in the Arai Valley in Israel and in Wadi Fanan in Jordan. They sought evidence of when domesticated camels were first introduced into the land of Israel and the surrounding region. The archaeologists Ezra ben Yosef and Lidar Safir Hen used radiocarbon dating to pinpoint the earliest known domesticated camels in Israel to the last third of the 10th century BC. Centuries after the patriarchs lived and decades after the kingdom of David, according to the Bible. Some bones in deeper sediments, they said, probably belonged to wild camels that people hunted for their meat. Dr. Safari Hen could identify a domesticated animal by signs in the leg bones that it had carried heavy weight or heavy loads. The findings were published recently in the journal Tel Aviv and in a news release from Tel Aviv University. The archaeologists said that the origin of domesticated camels were probably in the Arabian Peninsula, where borders the Avra Valley. Egyptians exploited the copper resources there and probably had a band introducing the camels. Earlier, people in the region relied on mules and donkeys as their beasts of burden. Again, that's camels have no business in Genesis. Now, why did Trust read that information? Because in our research and study, things are always passed off as history when in true reality they are not. And that story is given as an example based on not my research, but two scholars from Tel Aviv University who found it necessary to validate a statement that has been written in a religious text. And what it also shows is that information doesn't just stop with camels. It's a lot of events that are panned off as history or historical when in reality there's no evidence for any event taking place in history. One event is the Exodus. And that's not to negate, belittle, or wash away the tradition, the history, and the culture of a people. But it's only to put in proper context the realities of what took place versus what they say took place. One of the most important events of Jewish culture and experience is Passover. It celebrates a period of time when the Jewish people were supposed to be slaves in Egypt for 4 centuries. And this went on for many, many centuries. That means this story has been told as legitimate history for many, many centuries. For many centuries. Under further examination by anthropologists, archaeologists, geologists, and cultural historians, we find something very, very disturbing. And that is, there is no evidence, not one word, not one slipper, not one artifiable remain from that period. There's no Egyptian evidence, there's no Assyrian evidence, there's no Hittite evidence, there's no Greek evidence, there's no Roman evidence for no Exodus ever taking place on the grounds of Egypt. So much so that all of the Egyptologists now support the fact that there were no slaves in Egypt when the pyramids were being built. Well, it would be an anachronism for the pyramids and Jews to be in the same place anyway, because the last pyramid was built in 2700 BC, 2,700 years before the birth of Christ. As we already indicated in the article that I just read to you, that Abraham and his boys, which represent the foundation to Judaism, Abraham, the father of Judaism, was between the second millennium BC. Like I said, 1500 BC to 2000. That means that it was more likely almost 1,000 years before he would have been born. So how could he have been involved in building any pyramids, as slaves involved in any pyramids? And they talking about making mud brick and out of straw and all of this. Well, I've been to Egypt. Ain't no mud brick and no straw in not one block and no pyramid. Nowhere. I'm telling you, I see them with my own eyes. As a matter of fact, one stone in the Great Pyramid of Khufu, one stone is 2.5 tons. It's a stone. It's not mud brick. In no way. It's big as a block, so big, so high, so wide. One stone, 2.5 tons. And it was so accurately proportioned without no mortar, and it still stands the way it stood 5,000 years ago. You can't make it up. So the study of what we found in relationship to that information began for us to look not at the Bible as foolish history, but to look at it in a different context. Instead of looking at it as a literal history book, was to look at it as a book of principles and concepts that we use and live our lives by, based on how we see ourselves and how we see other people. So again, that's another issue. Everything